Thanks, James. Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Emma, for the opportunity to speak this afternoon. I'm going to try and translate what James has talked about into what happens in Manchester. So I'm going to give you my perspective on the 15 years that I've worked in the city. Spent first year of my career working at Manchester Airport in their environment department, which is a very interesting place to cut your teeth, working on sustainability, beavering away on environmental management plans, only to realise there's things called planes flying past your window every 30 seconds. So that was an interesting place to start. 11 years at the City Council in their environmental strategy team, developing citywide environmental policies. And the last year and a half working at Manchester's Climate Change Agency. So it's very much going to be my perspective, but hopefully start to bring to life some of the ideas and thoughts that James has put across. I'm going to talk you through kind of two stages, if you like, in the city's journey, particularly from a climate change perspective. So, and I'll start with this challenge really, and you could apply that to any area of policy, if you like, is how do you bring about the level of mass ownership and action that you need in order to deliver policy objectives in cities. If we accept that cities are increasing the places where change will happen, how do we bring about the scale of activity and change that we need to see? So we start here really. As a policy maker, the first thing that one has to do really is get politicians to try to agree with each other. Not always the easiest thing, but in Manchester, I'm pleased to say that we do have a very coherent political view particularly on climate change and its importance, and that Manchester as a city absolutely needs to be taking action. And the next step really, once you've got that kind of political mandate, if you like, is to go through some form of a policy making process. Quite often policy making exists in domains like this. A load of policy makers sat around a table thinking and writing about things which they may or may not understand about, but that's your job as a policy maker. You're going to write something about climate change this week. And there's another question really around, okay, well let's try and take this outside of a town hall in terms of the way that we develop and implement policy. And you know, we're a resource-strapped local authority, so who do we go and speak to? Well, all too often there's a temptation really to talk to the usual suspects. It's very easy for policymakers in the town hall to come to the universities, Siemens. Some of the bigger players in the city have a lot of presence, have a lot of reach. Typically, you work with those kind of usual suspects when you go through any policy making process. And there's another thing which always tends to play out really, which is those who shout loudest tend to get their views across. So you can, if you're not careful, you can skew that policy making process to a place that you don't necessarily want it to be. You know, activists, of which we have a number in the city, lots of very well engaged environmental groups, have a lot to say on the subject of climate change, as you would expect. But one has to be careful that that's not the only voice that we allow to be heard when we go through the development of a city climate change strategy. And what I'd kind of propose really is that if you do go through that slightly more traditional policy making process, politicians, policy makers working with the usual suspects, only listening to those who are already engaged, you'll end up in this situation. You'll make some progress towards your policy objective, whatever it might be, in this instance climate change, but you'll always be left with a gap. You will always be left with a gap in terms of where you need to be, because you've not been able to bring about the level of activity that you need. So in Manchester, there was a very conscious decision made in 2009, recognising that actually if we went through that more traditional approach, we'd set ourselves up to fail. And actually an issue like climate change is such that it requires such profound transformation across a whole city. It's not a single issue area of policy. It's not mandatory seatbelt, it's not a smoking ban, it's not drink driving. You know, it's not a single issue area of policy where you pull a lever and you do a piece of public engagement, try to get people on board. It's something which fundamentally affects the design of the city and the way that people operate within it. So to go through a kind of quite traditional, almost naive process of policy making, we knew at the time was going to be the wrong one. And what the climate change call to action was by the City Council was what you might now call devolution or big society or whatever the buzzwords of today are. And it was a recognition that only by having the whole city at large come together would we have any chance of making progress on climate change. And this is what the process looks like. So this isn't a load of boring policymakers sat in a dark room in the town hall. This is the city at large coming together. And when I was at the City Council, me and my team, we didn't write the city's climate change strategy. These people did. You know, people from local charities, local school children, local businesses, local residents came together to set out what they thought Manchester should do on climate change. And that is an incredibly risky thing to sponsor, if you like, if you're a local authority, if you're a politician, if you're a policymaker, because you've got no idea what's going to come out of the process. But it was fundamentally important as part of creating the right narrative whereby Manchester, you've said you want to see action on this subject. We agree with you as the City Council. Let's work together to bring about a collective shared solution to what action looks like in the city. And it's a little bit dated now, you can see from a couple of the faces on there, but nonetheless, that was the culmination of that process. Manchester, a certain future, our collective action on climate change. So that's the city's climate change strategy for 2010 to 20. And to reflect that kind of, if you like, devolved collective approach to the development of that document, there was a similarly devolved collective approach to the strategy's governance, which was the establishment of an independent steering group outside of the town hall, made up of representatives from public sector, private sector, third sector, academia, all working together collectively to champion the delivery of that document. And we've seen an incredible amount of things happen, a number of which have been fairly organic, actually. That's not so much a set of case studies, but you can see from some of the figures there that we are making progress as a city. You know, the Eco Schools figure, for example, is incredibly impressive. That's happened in the absence of any centralised Eco Schools support function. So 91% of schools in the city have chosen to become Eco Schools. I could give you loads of other examples like that. So we are seeing, we're seeing a lot of progress in Manchester, but, and there's that slide again, we're not seeing the level of change and progress and transformation that one needs to see, not just in Manchester, but in other cities. Because if you were to see the slide for Birmingham, Leeds, Newcastle, London, it would look remarkably similar to this actually. We're seeing some progress, but not the level that we need. So I'd just kind of tee this up as a first challenge, really, and we'll come back to this, really, is that whilst one can create that narrative around collective responsibility, how do you create an approach whereby something isn't the responsibility of nobody? And I think that's one of the key learnings from the last 6-7 years of implementing that climate change strategy. It's been the responsibility of everybody, and at times there's been questions around, is it therefore a question of nobody, the ownership of nobody? Second key thing that I want to talk to you about is context. I've told you a little bit about my background. I've started doing what I do because I want to save the world. And when you land in a city like Manchester, in any city around the world, you need to take the time to understand what it's about. Manchester, rapidly growing city, fastest growing city in the UK outside of London. Big economic success story, something that you will hear people talk about continually, about economic growth, jobs growth across the city and the city region. But beneath those kind of headlines, there's another Manchester here that perhaps isn't quite as well understood, or certainly not as widely promoted. So this is the percentage of the working age population in employment. We underperform in relation to all of our benchmarks, Greater Manchester, English average, core cities. This is the proportion of people in the city where family poverty is prevalent, worst performing of all of the English core cities. This is the proportion of Year 6 children who are classed as being obese. That's a figure that goes up slightly every year, and which is continuing to underperform against the English average. And you were delighted to hear that by virtue of the fact that you live in Manchester, a number of you, you're more likely to die sooner than if you lived in another city. Oh, and you're also likely to be less happy with your lot by living in Manchester. So that's all just a series of headlines. And I'm not giving you those to depress you, to try and distract you from what we're supposed to be talking about. I'm trying to make the point that context is absolutely critical. And if I was to have come into my new role with this mentality, which is, right, just finished 3 years of environmental science at Manchester University, which way to the Saving the World department, you would get very, very short shrift in most organisations, certainly in local authorities. So an understanding of context and trying to understand what are the more well-established, particularly socio-economic objectives in a city, that kind of grounding is fundamental to whether or not you're going to have success in taking forward an environment and climate change agenda. And this is a story, this is a process that we're working through as a city, and this is the new strategy which was launched in December, and it's an intention to start to respond to some of those challenges that we've identified over the last 6 or 7 years. So I'm intentionally not going to tell you how to successfully deliver a city climate change strategy because we don't know yet, and nor does any city around the world. So let's come back to this question about mass ownership and devolved policy development, if you want to give it that term. Again, visiting that approach whereby policymakers value and place the views of stakeholders at the heart of the policy-making process. And again, credit to the City Council, they sponsored a much more open approach to policy development in 2015. And the question that was at the heart of it was, what's your dream Manchester? So it wasn't a series of really tightly defined questions where they knew what the answer was going to be. It was just, what do you want? What do you think would be good to have in your city? And overwhelmingly what came back were comments like that. So a carbon neutral city, the cleanest air, a world leader in urban sustainability. Those are the things that normal people, not people like me and James, but normal people say when you stop them in the street. That's the stuff that's important to them. All of that was translated into the city's overarching strategy for 2016 to 25. And you'll see about a quarter of all of the commitments in there are about Manchester taking a really strong role on environment and climate change, again representing the views of the city at large. We came back and revisited that strategy last year, and we started with what people had said in 2015, which is you want to be a leader in urban sustainability, you want to see us taking action on climate change. What does that now look like in terms of a more coherent climate change strategy? So the Climate Change Agency facilitated a policy development process, but again it was about placing stakeholders from the city at large at the heart of that process. And we literally stopped people in the street. We didn't talk to people who we knew were already on board. We stopped people in the street and said, what do you think about this subject? And 97% of people that we spoke to think it's important that Manchester takes action on climate change. That could have been 27%, it could have been 57%. It was an incredibly open question. 97% of people think that this is important for Manchester and cities like Manchester. And we went beyond that and we said, look, this is just a starter for 10. What we've drafted in Climate Change Agency Towers, is the strategy ambitious enough? Or the draft strategy ambitious enough? 89% people said yes, 6% said no. One could be inclined to say, nice one, job done, let's just tweak it a little bit, change the photo on the front cover and publish it next week. But we were really keen to respond to the fact that there were a number of comments in there which suggested that actually universally people weren't happy with what was in that draft strategy. And this 35% versus 24%, these are, that's a summary of where people provided more detailed evidence, particularly the science that had changed from the publication of the draft strategy in July to when we finalised the consultation in October. And what people said was things are moving on incredibly quickly. And what you've set out in July is now not sufficient to enable Manchester to keep pace with the scale of the challenge. So, that represents those 6% of people, but it was really important that we interrogate that information to make sure that Manchester, if it's serious about this issue, puts itself on the right footing. And I'll come back to what that means in a moment. So this is the outcome, really. This is what the city said, or this is what we heard them say, that Manchester wants to play its full part in limiting the impacts of global climate change and become a zero-carbon city. Now, the timescale for that at the moment is 2050. We'll come back to that in a moment. The second thing I want to talk about, again, is context, really. And these are the 5 objectives set out in the city's climate change strategy. And you might find it interesting that resilience to climate change, zero carbon, and culture change are kind of, if you like, in the bottom of the list. They're not in order of priority, but there was a very, very conscious effort in the development of the strategy to be able to translate climate change into these things, the things that we know people understand better. The city's policymakers, the city's residents, and the city's businesses don't always necessarily talk in a language of climate change. So we do know, for example, that about 2/3 of people in Manchester don't take the recommended level of exercise for a healthy lifestyle. So we don't talk to them about getting on their bike and walking to save the world. We talk to them about trying to improve their health. We talk to businesses about the fact that Manchester's low carbon economy is the second fastest growing in the UK, and there's a £3.5 trillion global opportunity in terms of a global low carbon sector. So there's been a very conscious attempt here to try to translate action on climate change, which normally is defined by progress against these objectives, into economic and health success. And that just opens up the opportunity for completely different conversations. I said I was just going to briefly mention about zero carbon by 2050. There's another slide I've not included after the ... where we've intentionally kept that objective open to say that zero carbon by 2050, but to be changed in line with the global science and policy as it comes forward. And there's debate at the moment around whether developed countries and cities should actually become zero carbon by 2030. So in terms of the scale of the challenge, don't put your feet up and think about 2050, start thinking about 2030. And just the last couple of slides from me. That's all, very high level policy making, a little bit dry, granted, but, I wanted to give you that kind of perspective around how does change come about in cities. It comes about through a coherent policy framework. So that's what we've talked about. That's great. They're words on pieces of paper. But fundamental, really, is how do you actually translate that into things on the ground? James has touched on governance. There's work underway at the moment to try to establish a more coherent governance structure. The Our Manchester Forum is the senior most bit of governance in the city, and we've now got climate change very much on their agenda. So they are the senior most champions for this agenda. It's something which has kind of been over there historically. And then this second point about engaging and mobilising action. There can quite often be a temptation, particularly where you go through a more traditional policy-making process, to kind of wheel the leader of the council out, stick him on the steps of the town hall, he'll issue his edicts, and henceforth everything will fall into line. And I think what you recognise is that, nice as that may be, that doesn't happen, not least because cities are incredibly complex places, and people are incredibly complex things. Everybody has a slightly different way of thinking, and what we need to move to is a much more granular way of getting people engaged and mobilised, not these kind of one-size-fits-all engagement programmes. So just a couple of very brief examples finally in terms of where we're going with the implementation. The Climate Change Partnership Innovation Platform, whatever this thing ends up being called, is a response to the fact that the traditional way of bringing forward initiatives in cities doesn't really work, or it doesn't work at the scale or the pace you need it to. So a world where the local authority defines the problem, defines the solution, finds the money, commissions a private sector partner to deliver that solution, or regulates towards the solution they want. What that does is it creates a really nice long line of things you'd like to do, but with a massive bottleneck sat in the town hall. So if we're in a place where we accept we've got some nice pilot projects, how do you create the platform and the framework to enable those things to be delivered up at scale? We know we've got the best part of 20,000 academics within half a mile of each other. We know we've got 20,000 businesses in Manchester. How do you unlock the potential for them to do things differently so that things aren't always sat on the to-do list of a climate change agency with 3 staff? And we're seeing that. We're seeing projects come forward like Triangulum and City of Irvine Grow Green, where the public, private, third and the academic sectors come together to innovate. They're great. They're 4 projects in discrete places. But how do you get them to happen across a whole city? How do you reimagine the city as a living laboratory rather than just this part of it outside here? Second initiative that's in development at the moment is the Green and Healthy Manchester programme. This is a partnership between the Climate Change Agency, the NHS and Public Health Manchester, and it's trying to respond to the fact that if we're going to have any chance of delivering achieving our health and wellbeing targets within the budgets we've got, we need to move to a much more preventative model of health and wellbeing rather than the reactive approach, which currently costs many billions of pounds to deliver. So this is incredibly simple. This is about getting people gardening, growing their own fruit and veg, getting on their bikes, etc., etc., but translating climate change action into improving your own health and wellbeing. And it's intentionally very, very simple. And we think provides the opportunity to save a substantial amount of NHS funding. And I think the last example for me is an initiative we ran last year, Climate Lab. It was a series of experiments to test different ways to get people engaged. You won't be surprised to hear that where we ran sessions where people like me just talked at a room, they were really boring and not very popular. But when we did other things like music events and poetry events, they were much more engaging. And it starts to unlock the level of enthusiasm and inspiration that we need to see across the whole city. So that's been translated at the moment into a new 3-year programme of arts and culture-based activities. So final slide for me, and hopefully just a little bit of food for thought really, is that we're operating now in a devolved context. Now, what does that mean? Is that just moving powers and funding from Whitehall to somewhere in Manchester? If we get it wrong, it is. That's absolutely what it is. But what I would argue is that there's an opportunity within that context for everybody to start to play a much more active part, not just the traditional policymakers and decision makers. So I would encourage you to reimagine Manchester as a laboratory. Don't look at projects like the green roof in Stevenson Square and say, that was great, I wonder who did that. Think, how do I do that? How do I do innovative, interesting things which otherwise might not happen? Policies are not static. Policies are what are written at one point in time, but a policy is basically a decision to do something. You are all policymakers. You can all decide to do things differently. And you're all deliverers. Things aren't just delivered by people like me and the City Council. They're delivered by residents, businesses, big and small across the city. So this is a kind of, if you like, my call to action really, for you to have the confidence to think differently, try and do things differently, and try and make Manchester a better city, because that's what everyone said that they want to do. Thank you.